Jasmine Guffond is an artist, composer, performer and sound designer who has built a career by supplementing her creative work with work in live sound and post-production. In many ways, this mix of professional activities is typical of careers in music and sound design. However, Jasmine has been successful in transforming her critical attention on the structure of digital audio media into a basis for an international arts practice. Jasmine's work encompasses experimental music releases, gallery and site-specific sound art, installation work, and digital media. So I should start by thanking you very much for taking the time to talk to us about your work. We all look forward to learning something about your arts practice and your professional practice. I know that you've been studying as well, so I thought we'd start with often artists who are writing about their work, particularly when they're doing it in an academic context, is to focus on the concepts or the ideas that they're exploring in their work. And also to kind of link into the context. So I thought we'd just start with some of the ideas that you're working with at the moment.
Okay. I mean, my work is project-based, so themes do vary according to the context, or I might be invited to respond to a particular theme. But in the last years, so since undertaking the Sound Studies Masters, at the Art University in Berlin, there has been a focus in my practice on contemporary digital surveillance. And right now, I'm like you said, in the final year of a PhD at UNSW, Art and Design. And that's a practice-based PhD. And it's looking at sound as a method of investigation into online surveillance cultures.
Right. So it's interesting. So obviously there's two things there. There's surveillance and the online aspect, but also you're a person who works with sound, and so you're looking at the intersection between those two things, the intersection between sound and digital surveillance. So what is it? What is that intersection?
Well, I use sound. So for these projects, I sonify the data produced by surveillance technologies. Sonification is the translation of data into sound. And a practical example would be the most recent project, which is the Listening Back add-on. So it's a browser add-on for the Chrome and Firefox browsers that renders the data generated by internet cookies into sound in real time. So if you have the Listening Back add-on installed in your browser, you can hear cookie activity in real time while you browse online. And so you can hear how much you're being tracked by cookies as you go about your everyday browsing. So anyone can download or install it, but I've also used it for live performance and installation.
So sonification that's a concept that a lot of people might not be familiar with. For example, in military vehicles and aircraft, audio is used to, signal events in the environment that the pilot or the driver needs to know about. Audio has been used as a way to help people trading on the stock market, for example, to be able to detect changes in the market that they might want to respond to.
Yeah, probably the most regular or common use of sonification is with the EEC machines, like in hospitals. The doctors use where the sound of your heart rate. And so it allows the doctor to kind of like use their vision to look at the patient, but then be able to use their ears to hear, to monitor their heart rate, essentially.
Yeah, right.
I was just going to say that's probably the most common use of it, or that, everybody knows about.
Right, so that's a way of taking something that's invisible and making it audible. The way that a record of our travels around the web when we're browsing is recorded in cookies is a kind of invisible thing as well. And so that's what your browser plugin is trying to do, to display that invisible information.
Yeah, exactly. It's giving these sort of background processes that collect our personal data an audible presence. And much like with the EEC machine, because the way we browse online is we're very much visually engaged with the screen. And so we can listen at the same time to these background processes without interrupting sort of the flow of browsing online. So you can continue to check your email or post something or share a photo or chat with a friend while hearing how much we're being tracked by cookies. And I think that's really important, that you can hear these processes without kind of disrupting the sort of everyday flow of web browser. So you have the experience of browsing and hear these processes that are actually always there, but usually not tangible to us.
Right. So there's a sort of this business of leaving information on your computer to record where you've been is a kind of insidious process that we're not always aware of. But at the same time, this project of yours is a kind of sound design challenge. What choices did you make in terms of the sound material that you built into this browser extension?
Well, the data set that I had access to is determined by the browser API, so the application programming interface, and that's basically what data either Google or Firefox, Mozilla give third-party developers access to. So in the case of cookie data, the data I had was every time a cookie is inserted onto the website or deleted from the website or updated. So not every time the browser is reading the cookie activity. So I decided to give a sound to the different major platforms, Google, for example. And what's interesting is that the Google Analytics cookie is actually the most commonly used cookie on the entire World Wide Web. So I gave Google its own sound, and YouTube, which is also owned by Google, and Facebook and Amazon. And then some of the third-party cookies that were common across a lot of websites. So that's another sort of main data subset, is first and third-party cookies. So first-party cookies are any cookies that have the same domain name as the website you're on. So, for example, if you're reading The Guardian, any cookie that has the domain name theguardian.com is a first-party cookie, but any cookie with any other domain name is a third-party cookie. And third-party cookies are quite a good way of tracking you across different websites. And they're often, advertising brokers just collecting your data to then sell it on to other advertisers. So some of the common third-party cookies I also gave a particular sound, and then I created just a generic sound for all the other cookies, because they're like literally, millions of different cookies out there. So it would never have been possible to give each one its own sound.
Right. So you, as the composer, are able to listen to this composition as it unfolds, and it's telling you something about the environment that you're browsing in, the virtual environment that you're browsing
They
in.
definitely, like if someone's using the add-on and I'm not looking at their screen, I can totally be like, oh, that's a Google cookie, that's a Facebook cookie. Because I mean, things like Google and Facebook as well, like Facebook, wherever it has a the thumbs up like icon inserted on a web page, it will insert a cookie onto your page. So between the Facebook thumbs up like icon and the Google Analytics cookie, they're just on across so many websites.
So they're the main themes that you would hear in this web browsing composition.
Yeah, I mean, Google and Facebook are often referred to as a duopoly in as far as online tracking goes. They're definitely the top two for that specific behaviour.
And when you were making this plugin, were you thinking of the sound in terms of displaying information? I mean, we use the word display, which has a visual connotation, but the term auditory display is used. Were you thinking of it in terms of presenting information to the ears, or were you thinking of it as a musical work, or how do you think about the kind of aesthetic properties of the sounds that are built into the browser extension?
Well, I try and find a balance between creating something that has a kind of compositional or musical aspect to it, but that also can impart information if you want to take the time to sort of really listen. I think if you wanted to, you would be able to start to distinguish between, Facebook and Amazon and Google. But at the same time, there's like an interface where you can change the key of the cookies. And so I chose like scales that are in tune with each other. I mean, I worked with a programmer, and he said we should use the Tombro.js library for creating the sounds. And so I actually chose one of the default sounds from that library as the generic sound, and then the rest I created from either saw waves or sine waves or triangle waves or noise. And then there's different effects that you can use. So EQ, delay, reverb, chorus, flanger. And so you can use those effects in different combinations to sort of design the sounds, but starting with, say, a sine wave, for example. So they were the kind of programming parameters I had to work with.
Right, so synthesizing sounds using JavaScript, which is the programming language of the web, but there's also some sort of traditional musical ideas in there in terms of scales and keys.
Yeah, well, I've found with previous sonification projects that when there is actually so much information, it's hard to kind of get a grasp of it. And then if it's also a lot of dissonant information, it's even harder for our ears to kind of tune in. And we tend to maybe even tune out. So I think it's important for sort of to engage people for a while and also to give them an opportunity to get some kind of meaning from what these different sounds represent, to have it in tune.
Right. Yeah. So most listeners' ears are adapted to, for example, the major scale. So notes taken out of that scale will generally go together harmoniously. So why not use a structure like that most listeners can navigate orally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, having said that, the default sound is not tunable, so there is a little bit of dissonance there.
Yeah. Okay.
And I made the third-party cookies. It has the same sound for the generic sound, but it's a little bit more distorted. So you can also start to hear the difference, which are first and which are third-party cookies from the sort of generic sound.
Right. Yeah. So pitch and timbre are being used to differentiate these
exactly
kind of signals. Yeah.
And then on the interface, you can also fade in and out first and third party cookies. If you sort of completely fade out third party cookies, then you can hear how much of the noise they take up in that ecosphere.
So this is a really sort of practical way of bringing the world of audio and the world of surveillance together. I guess there's sort of other dimensions to the intersection between audio and surveillance. So there's a long history of phone tapping as being a kind of surveillance technique, but increasingly we're seeing, video surveillance is pretty broadly used in the built environment, but we're increasingly seeing audio surveillance in the streetscape as well. What other kind of issues around surveillance and audio are there that we should be aware of?
Well, I mean, with smart assistants, they are, forever listening.
Like this is Google Home and Amazon Alexa.
Exactly, and Siri from Mac.
Right.
I haven't looked so much into those because I'm more focused on, I guess, cookies, because the project engages with cookies, but they definitely, all those smart assistants are actually listening in this kind of traditional way. But what I have discovered is that any kind of software or hardware property on your smartphone or computer will be used to in some way collect data from you. That's essentially how online surveillance operates. It's a collection of personal data. And so they might use the microphone on your phone to collect that data, but whether they're actually like listening and recording the audio, or whether they're just using the microphone as a way of capturing data, like it might just be like if you're outdoors or indoors.
Right, yeah. So the concept of machine listening, Alexa and Google Assistant, they're specifically designed to be able to detect speech and interpret speech, but there might be other audible properties of the environment that are meaningful in terms of understanding our behaviour that these systems could be tuned to understand.
Exactly. Yeah. So machine listening or computational listening, it's using, the microphone, for example, but it's not necessarily listening in the way that we understand as humans listening to function.
They're scary ideas, and I suppose one of the aims of your work is to make this world of surveillance more apparent by making it audible in the example of the browser extension.
Yep.
Yeah. So what we're talking about here in terms of your practice is, the term for it, I guess, is sound art. Is that a term that you like to use? Do you think of yourself as a sound artist? What does sound art mean to you?
I have used it because it's a practical term. Like people immediately know that you're working with sound, but actually I'm trying to less and less because I do find the term sound art contentious, actually, because I feel like it suggests an art practice focused solely on the medium of sound, whereas artworks that use sound can also engage with a lot of other concerns and themes, for example, online surveillance. So I prefer the term sounding arts because sounding is a verb, so it suggests that sound is doing something, and that could be engaging with a whole lot of other issues that extend beyond the actual sound itself. Whereas I find when sound is a noun, I feel the focus is on the actual sound itself as a medium, which potentially ignores the context in which the sound is resonating.
Okay, right. So, we think of music as being an art that focuses on sound itself. Obviously, it in song it uses lyrics, and I guess there are some sound art practices that do focus on sound itself rather than.
It's true. There are some.
Yeah.
And for those practices, sound art is probably a very relevant term.
Yeah, interestingly, a lot of the sort of work that I'm thinking of, the experimental work of the American experimental work of the 60s and 70s, a lot of it comes from musical practice. From I'm thinking of people like Alvin Lucier, and there's many other examples where the phenomenon of sound itself is being explored in creative work that in those days happened to wind up in galleries because it didn't really fit in concert halls.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Alvin Lucier is a good example of a composer who a lot of his works are almost like sound experiments or kind of investigations into how sound functions, but yet at the same time there is a sort of poeticness to them. So they're not just a science experiment. They're kind of like a poetic science experiment. So he's an example of a composer who could kind of quite easily fit into sound art, though I'm pretty sure I've read interviews with him where he doesn't really like that to me.
Yeah, that'd be
for
right.
whatever reason.
Yeah. So you mentioned that context is really important, and so in this work around surveillance, the context is kind of global, to do with the technological infrastructure of our modern lives. But you've done other works that deal with context. For example, works that deal with aspects of the built-in environment. So there's a work called Current Harmonics, which is a site-specific work. So that's dealing with context in a slightly different way.
Yeah, so I was invited to do a residency and make something for a festival in the Black Forest, which is situated at a hydroelectric dam, an incredibly beautiful structure. And so then I was kind of researching about how hydroelectric dams function actually. And they usually produce AC electricity, so alternating current. And to my surprise, it's actually quite a simple mechanism. So essentially they're using the force of the water. Like you'll notice they're often built on a kind of slope. So the force of the water falling down makes a wheel turn around, and on that wheel are two magnets. And so the turning of the magnets creates an electrical force, like it creates electrons. Yeah, so that's how hydroelectric functions. And what I discovered is that there's these like what they call current harmonics, and some of the harmonics will make this kind of flow of electrons more or less efficient. And these sort of current harmonics might get introduced by, say, the lead. If there's kind of lead somewhere in the mechanism, that might introduce like I think a third or a fifth harmonic. And so then there's all these ways of trying to reduce it to make the electricity flow as efficient as possible. And what was interesting for me was that the current harmonics are just the way that sound waves work, which probably is just the way all waves work, but I hadn't really thought about it before because I've only really thought about sound waves. So in Germany, for example, the fundamental frequency is 60 hertz. I think in Australia it's 50. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, and you can kind of like when you hear it, earth hum, you can hear that frequency. Like, it's generally low in Australia 50 or in Germany 60. And then so the current harmonics are just harmonics of, say, 60 hertz. So, so then I just, I used a very, very simple, with Max MSP, I kind of learn as I go from project to project. So I think in the end, even though actually often it's like sine waves with electricity, I kind of like the sound of a saw wave more, and it sounded to me more like that earth hum sound that you hear. So I used mostly saw waves and pitched them at the different harmonic frequencies of what electricity would be in Germany. And then I literally just had the it ascending or descending between these current harmonics, and a lot of dissension because just in a way to imitate the flow of the water kind of crashing down.
So there's a couple of things to pick up there. So Max MSP is a software programming environment that is used for making music and sound, and in this case, an artwork. Is that software that you use regularly?
I use it for installations. I think it's really good for that.
Right, so it's a tool for producing sound in a way that doesn't necessarily follow ordinary musical structures. You can make it basically do whatever you want.
Exactly, you can do whatever you want.
So when you install a work like this, the physical environment that it goes into has a great influence on how what sort of equipment you use and how you deploy it, and I guess there's probably something about the character of the structures, the built structures that you're working with, that inspire or influence the creative choices that you make.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting with making sound installations because you realize once you're in a kind of gallery type environment or even just on site, you can't ignore the visual aspect of the work. Whereas for me, I've always just been focused kind of on the sound. And for that situation, I was basically offered this is what you can use. So I didn't really, it's not like I could pick and choose which sort of speakers I wanted. But I can't complain because from memory, it was a 48 channel sound system. And there were 4 subwoofers, which for this kind of very large concrete resonating space, I guess it wasn't the 4 subwoofers sounds like a lot, but in that space it wasn't, that much. And even though I didn't need 48 separate channels for the sound composition, because it was such a huge space, I knew that it would look more amazing to have 48. So the actual visual aesthetics kind of influenced how the installation turned out. And it does look amazing, the photos, because that structure is just amazing. You put 48 speakers in there and it looks incredible. And then I'd started, because I had the idea, I knew I only had a week to put it together. So I had the concept already and I'd kind of started with a max patch at home. And then when I was there, they set me up in a space. So I worked with those speakers and that system. And then, I always make sure that I have time on site because, like you said, a concrete structure has very particular acoustic properties, and then you always have to tweak it on site because it sounds so different to how it sounded in a room in a building.
Yeah, in a way, no different to rehearsing an ensemble in a new concert hall or a new venue. The music will always sound different in a different space. But often concert halls or art galleries are designed to be kind of neutral spaces in a way. But a massive structure like a hydroelectric dam is not neutral in any way.
Yeah, no. And I guess if you're, say, the sound engineer for an ensemble and then you go into a concert hall, there would be a house engineer there. And that house engineer would probably support you. And that house engineer works in that space all the time. So at least they're very familiar. But I suppose in that kind of situation, it's more up to you to go in there and work with the sound yourself on site.
Yeah.
And also in a way compose for the site. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's a very practical response to the idea of context, but then there's these other layers in terms of context with a site like that. It's a huge industrial plant and it's involved with the generation of electricity, and electricity has its own it suggests a kind of aesthetic of its own that presumably you're kind of picking up on in terms of the context, and that feeds into the work itself.
Definitely. I think it's really important to acknowledge the site, and not ignore it, because it does inform, it's part of the work.
Yeah. So we've got two different kinds of sites in the two works that you've talked about, this sort of ubiquitous web browsing, which happens in all different locations at different times, different people. And that's quite a distinct contrast to this very particular location in the hydroelectric facility.
Yeah, I mean, that's exciting if you get those opportunities to respond to different environments.
And you also work in fixed media, so in producing records. I like to call them records, but I guess they're not records anymore.
No, they are records.
Yeah.
Oh, well, no, they generally are come out in vinyl as well as digital.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So your latest release, which is called Microphone Permission, so that title is related to the surveillance theme.
Yeah.
Could you tell us, and well, hopefully we'll get a chance to have a listen to some of that material as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the
title,
the tracks that are on the recording and the title? Yeah.
Well, that album was developed over a couple of years, mainly because I'm trying to focus on a PhD, and so I would do music kind of on weekends, and the sort of source sounds, which are sort of like the sounds that were sort of the beginnings of the composition, often came from other projects like Current Harmonics. Like I used some of that material in one of the tracks, or another installation I did which sonifies the metadata from Twitter. Some of the sounds that were generated for that project, you know, became starting points for compositions. Or I did one work with a dancer where she was doing a piece for what the sound of a future dead forest would be. And so some of those sounds are used in a track, for example. And then I also had a job, I guess as sort of composer for a theatre piece in Western Sydney about 5 young sort of female identifying people who'd grown up in that area and kind of their stories and stuff. So some of the sounds I generated for that were also starting points for compositions. And then the titles very much came out of the PhD research. So Microphone Permission came from this tech scandal that happened, I think, a couple of years ago in Spain. And so the app for the most popular Spanish football team was discovered to be recording audio from people's phones and using that audio in conjunction with geolocation data to be able to tell if the game was being broadcast in unauthorized venues. So the people who'd installed these apps onto their phone, you know, had to say yes to microphone permission to install the app. And I mean, that's something that's really interesting with online surveillance is you rarely get the option to say no. It's like the app could function without microphone permission as a fan, except if you said no to microphone permission, you wouldn't be able to install it. So, you know, you always just say yes, yes, yes. You can access all of this because otherwise you just wouldn't be able to use that particular app. So anyway, they get asked if they can give microphone permission, they say yes, and then they get actually turned into unwitting spies on behalf of this like soccer league to sort of spy on unauthorized venues. And so what was interesting, particularly to me for that case, was that it did become a scandal, like it was found out. And so in its defense, the soccer league said that they weren't, as soon as the audio was being captured from people's phones, it was being immediately changed into binary code. So therefore they weren't actually like recording people's sound, they were just turning it into binary code as a way of explaining away actually a very invasive act. And I thought, but that's just what happens to all audio when it goes into the digital format, like all analog sound gets turned into binary code when it's digital. So I thought that was like it was interesting that they used that as to explain away the sort of intrusive nature of what they were doing, and it made me realise we just don't understand the way that these processes, and also the fact that a computer can often learn a lot more about you actually from audio in non-listenable, like human listenable forms, like the kind of information that they can extract from audio as binary code can actually often be a lot more than if they were just listening to your conversation. So that inspired the title of the album.
You mentioned a work that was using data from Twitter. Is that a piece called Sonic Profiles?
Yeah, that's Sonic Profiles.
Right.
So for that one, actually I was invited to be part of a group show at Mama in Albury Wodonga, a gallery there. And I guess I was invited because the theme was The Watched. And so the artists were kind of looking at these sort of more traditional ways of being surveyed, like being, followed with a camera or looking through peepholes. And that's sort of what inspired me to work with social media, because we watch each other so much on social media, and in a way online surveillance is also very participatory, so we actively participate either by watching other people or by accepting all these terms and user agreements that would probably explicitly say that we're collecting all your data forever or something. So so I decided to sonify the metadata of Twitter profiles, and I soon realised that I was going to have to work with very popular profiles to get enough data for a sound installation. And so I chose, therefore, Trump, who was by far the busiest, most active profile. And in fact, I could have just done an installation just from his Twitter feed, as well as Justin Bieber and Lady Gaga, and then also the BBC and CNN and Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. Because at first I think I wanted to do sort of different politicians, so Australian politicians, but their feeds just weren't active enough. And so the data that I was getting in that case is every time someone is replying or retweeting someone's tweet. So even though I'm saying Trump's profile is very active, he might only tweet 3 times or 5 times a day, so that wouldn't be very much data. So it's actually every time someone replies or retweets one of his tweets, for example. For that I would make kind of families of sounds. So Trump would kind of have a timbrel sort of sound signature, and Lady Gaga would have another kind of pitch and timbre, so that
right. So interesting collection. You've got politicians, media organizations, and pop music artists, and they all kind of have a certain. They certainly have a presence in social media, but they also have different kinds of power that they wield. And I guess the idea of a profile, you capture this kind of, a profile is like capturing the shape of something. So your sound composition is representing the shape or the activity that these entities produce or stimulate in social media.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of sonifying the activity, and with Trump, for example, occasionally it would go completely crazy, and then you would check and he'd just tweeted something about the Iran nuclear deal, for example, which kind of gave it this ominous undertone. But I was sort of also interested in what it means to have our personalities translated into streams of data. Like, what does it mean for us as humans to have these data profiles, and how do we relate to them? Like, I mean, I feel like if, especially now with COVID-19, but even before, like more and more, all our interaction is mediated via computers. And so what does that mean for us as humans to have our actual selves translated into data streams? Yeah, and it's used to feed us, targeted advertisements. But then it can also maybe affect your credit ratings, or I've read more examples. I don't know if it's more specific to the US for now, but it does affect people when they're applying for health insurance or credit, because all this kind of data is being collected on them and used to sort of sort and judge and discriminate. So it has very real world implications as well.
Once again, the sort of function of producing works that make these facts about our world audible and placing them in public spaces like art galleries is a way of kind of revealing these processes that are going on. Do you think of yourself as political activist in that sense? Is that part of how you think of your arts practice?
I don't know if I would. I mean, I wouldn't mind being labelled that, but I don't know. I think a political activist would be like more directly working in politics. I think if you really want to sort of make political change, then you'd be more directly working with, say, politics or legislation or regulation or. I mean, I definitely interested in engaging with politics and power structures. And but I don't know if I would be considered a political activist.
There's definitely a political dimension to the work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I guess from that perspective, in a way, it's kind of strategies of awareness. It's more about kind of creative or poetic methods of generating awareness around topics and thinking about them and discussing them, and rather than a kind of direct political action.
Okay, well, let's move on. So one of the things that I want to do in these lectures is to help students to see the kind of broad range of areas where their skills can be applied. And so I'm interested to know a little bit about your professional background, what sort of range of work related specifically to music and sound have you done in your career?
So I actually also did a master's at AFTRS.
The Australian Film, Television and Radio School.
Yeah. And then after that I was working as a sound editor in the film industry in Australia, but I must say not for too long before I relocated to Berlin. And actually I really enjoyed that work, sort of editing sound to film. So I was working for a sound designer called Sam Petty. I edited the atmospheres for Somersault, Kate Shortland's film. And then that was just when I just moved to Berlin, so I came back to work on that film. And then years later, she asked me to come back and work on Laura, her film. Sometimes people call it Laura, but Laura, because it was based in Germany. So it was also good that I'd been living there and I could speak the language. And I also recorded for that film. It's mostly set in the German forest. So before I came to Sydney to work on that film, I went into the forest, just actually in Berlin and just outside of Berlin in Brandenburg to record. It was interesting to have a film that's like completely set, or not completely, but mostly set in a forest, because there's not that many sounds. Like, it's very quiet, especially compared to Australia that has a lot more kind of loud sort of animal life. And then she asked me to work on her next film, which was also set this time in Berlin. And this time that was Berlin Syndrome. So then I came back to Sydney to work on that one as well. And that one was set in a abandoned building in Berlin. And so that probably had even less kind of sound. So actually it's quite a challenge to make atmospheres for very quiet environments.
Right. So, sound editor for films. What sorts of other things have you done in the area of sound?
Okay, and then in Berlin, and I still do sometimes work as a front of house sound engineer. So live at various venues. I think I started by working for one promoter, and he would put on concerts at different venues. Then there's one artist that I toured with a few times, and now it just, because I have been a lot more in Australia. So I mean, as a freelancer, in some ways you're not really free. So as soon as you're, I was in Sydney for 7 months at the beginning of the PhD, and so I said no to a lot of sound jobs up, and then eventually, you go lower down in people's lists of who to call, which was kind of fine because so now I still surprisingly get some job offers, and they're generally from people who might be doing a one-off project and they have funding and they like working with me.
Right, so that's an interesting theme that's come up in other conversations. The personal relationships are very important, but the other thing that you mentioned was that freelancer, you're sort of obliged to say yes, or the more you say yes, the more likely you are to receive a call. So that's an interesting insight into the life of freelance work.
Well, because it is a precarious income in a way, like it's not fixed, so you do feel like you should always say yes to a job if you can do it, even if at times it's sort of a bit much. So you can end up being like super busy, overworked, or then at the other extreme and having no jobs.
Yeah. What about your musical background?
Okay, so I grew up playing classical flute, and then I started playing bass guitar in experimental rock bands. And then I got an Akai S1000 sampler, and I started making loop-based electronic music in a duo called Minute with Torben Tilly. And then I was literally actually forced to start using a computer for making live music. I mean, I was already using it, of course, for recording and mixing. Living in Berlin, and I was going to do a gig in London, and I used to always carry this sampler on the plane with me. And then after 9/11, it was too big. I wasn't allowed to carry it on the plane anymore. And I never trusted sort of putting it with the rest of the luggage. So then I got Ableton Live and quickly learned, in a way, how to use Ableton Live in the way that I'd been using the Akai S1000 sampler. And now I make music with a laptop, and when I perform live, it's with a laptop as well.
Once again, geopolitical events have an impact on your work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for making the time to talk with us and giving us some insights into the work that you're doing and your background. I'm sure that it'll be very interesting and valuable for our students to get a sense of the kind of diverse range of activities that you're engaged in. So thank you very much, Jasmine.
Thank you. Yeah.